So this year's Youth Justice Summit 2024 is hosted and presented by the Michigan Center for Youth Justice, the Campaign for Criminal Justice Transparency, and Gryphon Place Kalamazoo. My name is Ashante Collins. I'm the Executive Director for the Campaign for Criminal Justice Transparency, and it's my pleasure to welcome you into the space today. I would like to take the opportunity to thank Michelle Weemhoff of Michigan Center for Youth Justice and Tia Whitley of Gryphon Place and their respective organizations for helping to co-sponsor today's event. And so just to give a little brief discussion about why we are here today before we dive into our breakout sessions. We wanted to bring all of you together because you are the stakeholders, the leaders, and the drivers behind all the wonderful work that is happening around the youth and the youth-inspired initiatives in Kalamazoo. Whether that effort is citywide or countywide, each and every one of you are contributing factors in the lives of our youth. I say our youth because as many of us have grown up hearing the phrase, it takes a village to raise a child, we also have heard the phrase, the child who is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth. We don't want our youth to feel like they have to do the latter, so we should be focused on uplifting the former and treat every child in our community as our own when encountering them and having interactions. Kalamazoo has the opportunity to create an early diversion infrastructure where we don't have to wait for our children to enter a system where we know it has an oppressive history that once it grabs a hold of you, sometimes holds you forever. We don't want our children to have to search for the love and the support that they need from their community, but instead we want to be there to anticipate their wants. Our mission at CCJT is to help to create an anti-oppressive criminal legal system here in Kalamazoo County with the help of the entire community, which includes all of you. But as we are doing that, we want to keep one of our most vulnerable populations out of its doorway. The goal of today is to gain insight and understanding about how we as a community can build an early diversion infrastructure, especially to divert young Black boys away from the system here in Kalamazoo. As you listen and participate in today's breakout sessions, ask yourself, what can I do to help keep our children out of jail, out of the juvenile homes, and out of the path that can uproot their lives, dreams, and goals? With that, I want to welcome Michelle Weemhoff of the Michigan Center for Youth Justice to come up.
Hi everyone, how are you? Let's jump into it. So I'm going to get started and sort of give a little bit of background about how our involvement in this project came to be and really give more of a statewide perspective that creates the context for the work that you're doing here locally. So we're talking a lot about racial disparity today, and as a white woman I feel like it's imperative that I sort of acknowledge that I'm going to be using terms like youth of color and BIPOC youth, which stands for Black, Brown, Indigenous, and people of color. And I try to use person-first language, but sometimes we'll end up using identity-first language. And also, I use youth justice and juvenile justice interchangeably a lot of the time, and try to use the term youth justice as something we're building toward, and the juvenile justice phrase to reference a system that we are familiar with. And with the intention, of course, of being respectful and inclusive, but language is ever evolving, and so I just wanted to put that out here at the beginning. All right, so let's jump into it. About 3 years ago, the Michigan Center for Youth Justice was invited into Kalamazoo by the Kalamazoo Community Foundation. I was so excited about this project because I live in Kalamazoo County, and so it was really wonderful to hear that they had an interest in exploring what was going on with the youth justice system in Kalamazoo. And their initial question was a concern around why we had so many young Black boys entering our justice system. So we did research with a lot of different sources. We were lucky enough to have input from the Kalamazoo Department of Public Safety, as well as the courts, as well as other data from Michigan State Police and statewide data sources. And what we found, unfortunately, was pretty alarming, that when you look at the year 2022, and I'm going to read this because it's very precise the way they talk about statistics, that over the past 10 years, we have seen a pretty steep decline in the number of arrests, but unfortunately, we've seen a really significant disparity, and that Black youth are arrested at 11 times higher the arrest rate than their white peers. And when you look at that number at an annual scale, it's about, Black youth account for about 18% of the population, but 68% of the rest countywide. And the city of Kalamazoo, that number is actually a little bit higher. Probably, last check I checked was around 72% and maybe a little higher in recent years. And among the youth referred to juvenile court, Black youth were placed in detention at twice the rate of white youth, but they were referred to diversion slightly less than white youth. So these numbers are pretty alarming, right? And before we get too upset or start pointing fingers or shaming and blaming, I think it's important to acknowledge that racial disparity is an insidious problem across the country, across our state certainly, that it's not isolated even to just the justice system. So we are talking about long-term systemic racism that is pervasive in multiple systems and has been for hundreds of years. You know, our juvenile justice system was created in 1907, and the context of when it was created at that time still today influences how our system is operating. So that's not to minimize this problem, but it's just to acknowledge that this is a baseline that we need to improve from, and that we're not here to point fingers or assign blame. We're here to take collective responsibility for these numbers, because together all of us are recognizing this as a problem and doing all of our parts to make sure that we can reduce these disparities. All right, so with this big data picture in mind, we asked the community, why do you think this is? Why are we seeing such significant racial disparities? And there were a lot of different reasons. I'm sure all of you would agree, and there's many more than this here. But things like poverty and lack of access to opportunity, exposure to trauma, lack of support for families, lack of access to physical and mental health, inadequate prevention and diversion services, and also probably combined with bias in certain systems as well. But a lot of different competing factors. How do you tackle these huge systemic challenges? And so we set out as a community to create a plan of what it would look like to create an anti-racist youth justice model. We did not have a definition for this when we started, but we knew that this was going to be an important step forward to actually make the changes that we needed to see to drive those racial disparities down. And so we're defining anti-racism as the intentional effort to combat racism in every form. And that means proactively examining our policies and practices, again, some of which have been created well over 100 years ago in terms of the structure of our systems, and really trying to influence those practices, attitudes, behaviors, and cultural norms that have embedded with systemic racism. So, and again, we're not blaming any one stakeholder group. We're not calling anybody racist, but we are acknowledging that this is a pervasive problem that requires a community level response. And at the time, the county, the city, CMH, ISK, what are they called? They're all also committed to acknowledging that racism was a public health concern, that it was very much tied with gun violence in our community, which also was identified as a public health concern. And in doing so, really made that commitment to try to approach all of our practices in Kalamazoo County through an anti-racist lens. And through numerous community conversations, we did listening sessions with over 100 young people. We met with a lot of people in this room. We were told sort of 6 overarching themes of where we needed to see improvements. And this really established a framework for how we're going to move this work forward. And it also is creating a framework for what you're going to hear about today in some of the mini sessions. So hopefully some of these things will sound familiar and almost repetitive by the end. The first, of course, is youth leadership, youth and family voice and leadership. Making sure that the work that we are doing are informed by the people who are most directly impacted, that we take the opportunity to listen to young people and listen to their ideas, teach them tools for advocacy and empowerment and leadership, and allow them to be part of creating that solution. The second pillar of this framework is fostering an anti-racist culture. really acknowledging, as the county and the city had, that this is a pervasive problem and that together it is something we want to tackle. People feel uncomfortable talking about these uncomfortable topics, but it requires us to look at our policies, to look at our practices, and make actual changes when we see areas that could be improved. Data transparency and coordination. So in order to look at those problems, we need to have data that is collected regularly, and we need to be able to access that data, see what it is, have that transparency so that we can try to work toward improving it. And our data systems can be tricky because of regulations, HIPAA laws, and things like that. So it does require a coordinated effort to make sure that information across systems can be shared and used for systemic improvement. The next piece is around diversion policy. So as you will hear today, and we talk about some of the statewide reforms, making sure that our policies support diversion as early as possible. We want to have a system where there's a continuum of diversion options, where you don't just wait, where you don't have to wait until a child is referred to court before they can be diverted and connected to a community service. You want to have that opportunity before they're arrested, right after they're arrested, when they get to the prosecutor's office, when they go to court, and even predisposition. We want to have options along that entire continuum. Once you divert the child to a community service, you want to have a robust array of community-based services that are culturally competent, trauma responsive, and really meeting the kids at the developmental level that they need. And we are so resource rich in Kalamazoo that having that coordination piece of tying all of our groups together really is the only thing that we need to really wrap around a child. And then the last piece is making sure that we have data-driven planning, oversight, and accountability. So even when we do have these numbers, which we have the numbers here, and they haven't changed that drastically over the past, I'd say, 5 years, making sure that there's some process where we're using that data to continuously improve. And I was at a wonderful convening a few days ago that ISK put together where we talked about data from KDPS, and I'm sure we'll hear a little bit more about that today, but using real-time data to really be responsive to what is needed, being able to plan, design interventions, and then having some level of accountability and oversight where the community is involved in that process. And I think CCJT has been doing a lot of great work in that space. All right, so that's the big picture of what we were working on in Kalamazoo over the past 3 years. And while these conversations were happening locally, we also had a lot of similar conversations happening at the state level. In 2021, Governor Whitmer appointed the Michigan Task Force on Juvenile Justice Reform, which was a significant undertaking to research what are the problems in our youth justice system and how can we fix them. And through that work, they came up with 32, well, let me just back up and say, they found a lot of problems. I'm sure you were not surprised. I won't read through every problem here, but a lot of them were reflective of things that were happening at the local level. Nearly half of all of the petitions during the time that they studied were for children, or were for status offenses, meaning not illegal, not something illegal that for an adult, running away, skipping school, that kind of thing, or non-person misdemeanor offenses. And nearly 12% were for kids 12 and younger, which is incredibly concerning to me. But a perfect opportunity to connect a young child to a community-based service instead of the justice system. Other findings were that we lacked a policy framework and an infrastructure for diverting youth from the justice system, as I've sort of already explained. And again, that Black youth statewide were overrepresented. We also lacked standards for legal representation, which we'll talk about in a minute as well. And that there was just sort of inconsistency in terms of the quality and the types of services and the access to services. There was also quite a bit of recommendations related to residential facilities. So once a youth is adjudicated and they're receiving treatment at a long-term facility, there was a whole separate work group that spun off of that to come up with recommendations there. So a lot happened from this. And as a result of this report and input from so many different stakeholder groups, bipartisan support from both sides of the aisle. They came up with 32 recommendations with some bullets underneath that were translated into 20 pieces of legislation, 19 of which were signed into law in December. The one little bill that we've not quite signed yet, so please call your state representatives and senators, was related to establishing funding and standards for juvenile legal representation. So we do not have consistency in that across the state. That bill is still pending, but all of the other bills passed, and they go into effect for the most part on October 1st, which is next week. So this is very exciting, timely for you to understand what are the state laws that are going to actually enhance the work and maybe even give you access to more funding in your program. That's probably what you're most interested about. Before we get started on that, just so we're all kind of on the same page, the juvenile justice system in Michigan is a county-run system. So we have 83 counties, and we say there's probably 83 different ways of doing things, probably more. Some counties are very coordinated, they have a lot of partnerships, they have a lot of resources. Kalamazoo is fortunate to be one of those counties, and we have a court that is very involved. We also have a number, the residential facilities in Michigan are mostly run by private for-profit organizations. There are 2 state-run facilities, and the primary source of funding is the Child Care Fund, and that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. Up until this point, the Child Care Fund has been a 50-50 split between the state and the counties. So with the total fund is somewhere around $350 million. And that means the county pays for all juvenile justice services, and then the state will reimburse them at 50%. So whether that's probation services, a community-based program, or going into a residential facility, the county was getting a 50% share back. It's a little simplified, but for this conversation, that's how it works. With these new policies, and I won't go through all 19, but I'm going to tell you the most important ones that I think are really relevant to the work we're going to be talking about today. The first one is there was a change in the way the funding reimbursement is going to occur. So starting October 1st, all community-based programs will be able to draw down a 75% reimbursement. That means the state is going to pay for almost all of that service. So that includes probation, any community-based program that is a partnership with the court. It also includes things like respite care and shelter care and reentry. So that it really allows us to think about how can we build out that community-based continuum and reduce the kids going into residential. There will probably still be a need for residential, and that will still be reimbursed at the 50% rate. But with this additional money coming in for community-based programming, that maybe can allow us to think more broadly about what services do we have here that could be plugged into that continuum of care. The changes in this law also are ensuring that all of the services we are using are research-based. We've kind of moved away from the term evidence-based, but you know, we're doing things that research supports in terms of youth development. It is establishing standards around probation, and every community must hire a quality assurance specialist to make sure that the types of programs that they are operating are meeting a quality standard, which is great because I said that inconsistency across the state has been concerning for many years. The other major piece of these reforms is that the Diversion Act is opening up more broadly to allow diversion to happen earlier than before a petition was filed. And you can draw down this child care fund dollars to pay for it. So now, if you have a partnership, or if you identify an at-risk youth through a school, through law enforcement, or through the prosecutor's office, the court can pass through the dollars to those entities to do diversion in those programs, which is really exciting. It does require a lot more coordination, right? Because the money is always going to go to the court first. But it opens up this possibility of what could it look like to have a community-based early diversion program, which we're going to hear about shortly. How do we make sure that that partners with the schools and with law enforcement and with the prosecutor's office? So that's where the creativity comes in each community, because Every community is going to do it their own way. There's not a set process, and a lot of communities now are in the process of planning, like, what does it look like here? What does our continuum look like? How can we draw down those state dollars to really support the work? Other piece is that they are going to require risk assessment at certain decision points now. This is a little bit contentious because the state is requiring a specific risk assessment tool for detention. So we're going to have to kind of see how it goes. And I can answer questions about that later as well. But at the point when a youth is diverted, there needs to be a risk assessment when they go into detention, I believe when they're adjudicated, and then when they go into placement. So really making sure that we're not putting low-risk kids deeper into the system if we don't need to. Again, I won't go through all of these, but if you would like a copy of these slides, I'd be happy to provide that so you can see the breadth of all of the different bills that passed. One thing I'm very excited about is that we will be, these reforms are eliminating all fines and fees for young people who are going into the court system. There will be more oversight through the ombudsperson's office, and they were able to get legal defense representation in the state appellate defender's office. We just don't have the trial level, I guess what it's called. And then, of course, more developmental considerations for weighting kids to the adult system. So we want to divert as many different decision points as we can. We call them off-ramps, and we want to create a lot of off-ramps so that we can get families to the support that they need. I am not going to talk about all these different work groups. I only put them in here for the one person in the room who's like, I want to know every single thing that's happening. This is just to give you a big picture that a lot is happening. The state is coordinating a lot of different efforts, a lot of different stakeholders figuring out all these policies. And the one thing that y'all might be interested in is that every community, including Kalamazoo, has an implementation team to figure out how do we implement all of these policies and all of these new regulations. And so that implementation team, I believe, has already started meeting. It is being convened by the court. But of course, there's always opportunities for community to weigh in. And I think that's really important that we know that there is a multi-systemic approach to making sure that our reforms are successful here. It was a recommendation by the statewide task force to make sure that you had cross-system input, and I think that's one of the things that Kalamazoo does so well. So I just wanted to leave you with some of these questions to think about throughout today, but also as you sort of go back and think about how are these reforms going to apply to my work? Where can I put pressure in our community to make sure we're drawing down as many dollars as possible? The Child Care Fund is uncapped. So as much money as we're willing to put in, the state has to reimburse that amount at 75%. So the question is, will the increased reimbursement from the Child Care Fund be leveraged in our community to expand diversion? And that might be a question for the county commission or other budgeting entities here. It might be something that your system really would be interested in. So we need to continue that conversation. How will the screening and assessment tools be used at different decision points? And how can community organizations help and expand and coordinate all these efforts, which is what we're going to be talking about today. So I just want to leave you, of course, as an advocate, I can't leave the microphone without asking you to take some kind of action. So the actions that I'm leaving with you today are first and foremost, we need to get that bill passed to make sure that all kids have access to legal representation when they go to court. It is imperative. We have a few months left by the end of the calendar year, but not that many session days, especially with the elections coming up. So please contact your legislators. Let them know that you want this bill, House Bill 4630, to move forward. Also, think about how we can advocate for policy and practice in the local level to expand diversion, and sign up for our mailing list, which I think some of you might have done when you signed in today.